Okay, in this video we're going to talk about the end of Early Iron Age 2, and what serves really as a transitional phase from the Early Iron Age to the next period of ancient Greek history, which is what's known as the Archaic Age. So the end of Early Iron Age 2 is really marked by a lot of things happening that suggest a recovery in the Greek world, in the sense that civilization is starting to build up again in the mainland Greek and sort of the islands, that region of the Mediterranean. So I want to take this kind of bit by bit and talk about the different things that we're seeing that are indicative of this newfound rise of civilization, and a little bit about what's causing them. So first up, by this time, and we're looking really at the early 8th century BC. We said early Iron Age 2 goes to about 750 BC, so that earlier part of the 8th century BC. One of the things that we notice in this period is a pretty notable population growth, right? The population of Greece really declined at early Iron Age 1 following the dissolution of the palace system of the Mycenaeans, and now we see a real big boom, and it started to rise again. And the reason for this seems to be at least related to, if not entirely caused by, the fact that the Greeks have started to switch from an economy based on pasturage to one based on crops. And so what do I mean by this? Well, in early Iron Age 1 and 2, it seems that a lot of Greek households were focused on raising livestock, cattle, goats, sheep, those kinds of things. And that wealth really was corresponded to how much livestock you owned. We see that, for instance, in the Society of the Homeric Poems, the livestock are really important to them, both as households and even as raiders. They often raid for more livestock. And now with this population boom, we're seeing a switch where now instead they're raising crops. Wheat and barley would be really important there, along with other staples like legumes, which are like beans and peas, some vegetables, some nuts, olives and grapes are also really big for the Greeks. So that kind of crop raising. And not only that, but the methods that they're using to raise crops are better. They're getting better yields. They'll do things like let fields lie fallow, where they don't use the same field year after year, so they don't deplete the minerals in the soil. They'll replenish the soil by planting kind of green crops, like little bits of legumes, and then breaking them up and putting them in the soil to decompose. They have some new methods that mean that they're going to get some better yields on their farms. And so along with this shift, we see a social shift. Not a big one, I'll admit. Because whereas before wealth was how much livestock do you own, now it's how much land do you own, because land's used for raising crops. Of course, in general, the people who had large herds had a lot of land for pasturage, where their herds could graze. And so they'll just convert that land to land for crops. So there's not a big change in who is elite and who is wealthy, but the basis of wealth is now much more land owned rather than livestock owned. Now, this is fine for the elites who own humongous amounts of land, but for other people who have smaller plots, these kleroi, right? Remember, each household, each oikos has a plot of land called the kleros. After generations and generations of dividing that amongst living sons, a lot of these kleroi, these little plots of land, are pretty small. Not enough to really raise a family on or support a family on. And this can lead to some issues. So we get what's called land hunger, is the term for it. It just means there's not enough land for everyone. Although really, there would be enough land for everyone. The problem is more that most of the land has now been consumed by the large estate owners. And so in order to combat land hunger, what we see is an early wave of migration. Right? So we'll see some fresh waves. We talked about a wave of migration in early Iron Age 1 out to Asia Minor. This wave of migration really hits Sicily, which is the island off of Italy, and then southern Italy. And we see a number of Greek colonies and trading posts popping up in that region. Okay. So let's hop from there to talking about trade. So we had said that during the early Iron Age, trade wasn't really happening over long distances, whereas the Minoan and Mycenaeans were trading with Egypt and Mesopotamia and the cultures of Asia Minor. In the early Iron Age, a lot of the trade was local. Things were made locally and traded locally, with some evidence that was starting to change in early Iron Age 1. And so that process speeds up. And by early Iron Age 2, we have a lot of evidence that long-distance trade is resuming in the Greek world. So for one thing, some of these colonies that are being established in this period are trade colonies. They're meant as trading posts. Merchants set them up to facilitate trade with other cultures in the Eastern Mediterranean. We have some famous examples. The site of Almina, which is in northern Syria, for instance, and the site of Pithecusae, which is around Naples in Italy, are both trading posts that were established by people from the island of Euboea in Greece. The Euboeans seem to have had a kind of a lock on a lot of commerce at the time. And there are others as well that pop up around the Mediterranean world. We know that the Greeks need to get certain resources from outside the Greek world. They need metals, but also luxury goods. We see them importing ivory and amber, things that just aren't available there. In turn, what are they exporting? Well, pottery for one. Some of their pottery is very finely made and is going to be exported. We'll talk about that more when we look at pottery. Wools, hides, leathers, right? Still representing sort of the tail end of the Greek world that is structured around livestock and herding. Over time, the kind of exports that the Greeks are exporting is going to change, though, and it's going to become things like olive oil, wine, right? Things that represent their newfound focus on crops, as well as stone and marble. Greece just happens to have some really good deposits of stone and marble available to it. Now, in order to fuel this kind of long-distance trade, I think this is something we mentioned before, what you really need are surpluses. Someone has to have enough stuff that they have extra they can trade away to get goods. And this is going to be something that these large estates will have. If you are a wealthy person and you hold a humongous estate, then you're going to have more food and crops than you can possibly use. And that's going to allow you to fuel trade and to send things away. And I will note that most of this long distance trade is elite trade, right? It's only the really wealthy people who are able to send goods out and to get goods back and to get these high value goods that are often used as status symbols, right? Like jewelry and ornaments and things like that. For the most part, most people are still living on their own farms and they are either self-sufficient or engaging in fairly just local trade for necessities, right? Crafts and things like that. Another aspect of trade in this period, though, is that we're creating really a need for a full-blown merchant class. As trade picks up, you need a group of people who take the goods from place to place. And so we see the growth of a merchant class in the Greek world that's fairly wealthy, right? They're not the elite landowners, they're their own group, but they're still fairly wealthy. As well as some other occupations are showing up. Shipbuilders, for instance, most of this trade is happening via the sea because the land is rocky and difficult. So we're getting shipbuilders and sailors and things like that as well. I also want to mention that the Greeks learn how to write again. So we saw that the Minoans and the Mycenaeans had their own system of writing, linear A and linear B. And then writing goes away. It's not really needed in the kind of society that we see during early Iron Age Greece, where it's not a complex civilization. But they pick it up again now here at the end of early Iron Age 2. And it's not the writing systems of the Mycenaeans or the Minoans. They're not picking up linear A and B. They're getting a new alphabet. And they're getting it from a group known as the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are a group of people who live in kind of like modern day Syria on the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean, and they were they dominated a lot of trade in the Mediterranean. They were known as a merchant people. And so it's natural that the Greeks would come into contact with them as their own trade is starting to really come into its own again. And they pick up not only stuff from trade, they also pick up ideas. There's a lot of cultural exports and imports along with this. And we're going to see that impact in art and architecture, but it's also going to impact writing. So they pick up the Phoenician alphabet and they make some changes to it and develop their own Greek alphabet, but it's really similar. And I'll mention the Phoenicians get their alphabet ultimately from Egyptian hieroglyphs, so it's descended from there. And the Greeks will pass their alphabet on to the Romans, and we get our alphabet from the Romans. So the English alphabet today descends from this chain of like Egyptian hieroglyphs to Phoenician to Greek to Latin to us. Okay, so yeah, they now know how to write again. That being said, we don't have a lot of writing from this period, right? We're going to start to see more texts being produced, which have been preserved, and some early inscriptions, but there's not a ton that's happening right now. Just because writing exists doesn't mean a lot of people knew how to do it, for instance. I'll mention very briefly pottery. We've talked about how geometric pottery dominated in early Iron Age too, and it continues to do so. But we are going to see some new developments, like the introduction of figures, human figures, and scenes. And also that contact with other cultures that trade is allowing for means that the Greeks are going to start to pick up some trends and styles and techniques from the Near East and the cultures over there. And that's going to create a new type of pottery, what's known as Orientalizing pottery. The Orient here just refers in general to the East because it's coming from Eastern cultures. And this developed starting around 730 to 720 BC. Now I'm going to talk a lot more about all this in our next lecture, which is going to be just on the pottery of this period. I'll also mention temples. So we said, okay, the Minoans and the Mycenaeans didn't build temples. They might have had shrines, almost certainly did, but they didn't build temples the way the Greeks did. At the end of the early Iron Age, probably around 800 BC, we see the first firm evidence for a Greek temple, a large building that is dedicated solely to the worship of a god or a goddess. And again, I'm going to get more into the details of the structure and the architecture in our discussion of art in this period. But I'll note a couple things. And a major one is, well, if there are temples, this must mean that there are people in the community who have the time and the wealth and the authority to order other people to do work to build this temple. And to spend all of this on a community project. So it suggests that, yes, we do have an elite that has the resources and the authority to get such a project done. There's also a suggestion here that people are becoming a bit more community-minded. And what I mean by that is wealthy people, rather than building up their own homes necessarily, or building a big chieftain house, something like that, they're spending their money and their resources on something that benefits, theoretically, the whole community, which is a temple. And so they're claiming status by showing how committed they are to the community, rather than necessarily by trying to distinguish themselves as kind of better and bigger than everyone. And this is a kind of thought we'll revisit when we look at some of the literary texts especially. And there's a suggestion that there is this kind of shift where you're encouraged to be a bit more community spirited, starting in the archaic and classical period of Greece. Now there are some specific temples that, rather than belonging to one community, are considered belonging to the entirety of all the Greeks. These are the Panhellenic Shrines, or sanctuaries. We'll call them sanctuaries for now. They're sanctuaries because they're much bigger than just one temple. They often are an entire complex of buildings that go along with that temple. And they're Panhellenic because, like I said, they don't belong to a single community. They belong to all Greeks. Right? Anyone who is a Greek is allowed to visit there, worship there, sacrifice there, and participate in the activities that go on there. So I'm going to mention a couple examples. You'll probably have heard of one or two of them. One big one is the sanctuary at Olympia. This was dedicated to the god Zeus and the goddess Hera, and this is the site of the Olympian Games, which we'll discuss more in a later lecture. There is the sanctuary on the island of Delos that was sacred to Apollo and Artemis. There was a sanctuary at Dodona in Greece, which was the site of an oracle of Zeus. And then maybe the most famous is the sanctuary of at Delphi in central Greece. It is dedicated to the god Apollo and is the site of his own oracle. Again, we're going to talk more about that in a later lecture. Okay. But yeah, these sanctuaries, again, are meant to be shared by all of Greece, right? All Greeks come there to worship together. And they may be a sign, or maybe a byproduct, of how much the Greeks are now interacting with non-Greeks, with people from other cultures. It may be that this is a way to assert Greek identity and to distinguish yourself from others, right? What does it mean to be a Greek? Especially since Greeks are scattered around many different areas. They have different dialects of their own language. They have some different traditions and different styles of material goods. Well, one thing is we all believe in the same gods, and we can worship them at these sanctuaries. The last thing related to these religious ideas I want to talk about is the rise of the hero cult. What do I mean by the hero cult? Around this time, we begin to see evidence that different communities are worshiping heroes, right? So a hero cult is the worship of a particular community, by a particular community, of a specific hero. And the hero is someone that comes from the legends of the Greeks, things like the story of the Trojan War, or other stories of heroes that they were told. But this person is supposed to be connected to the community in some way. Maybe he supposedly was born there. Maybe he did a great feat there. Maybe he died there, right? Any of these things could connect him. And so they worship, right? So this is a community's worship. They worship him in some way. And they ask for his protection, or hers. There are examples also of heroine cults, like Helen at Sparta. And they ask for protection from that hero or heroine for the community. And they also have shrines to them. They're not full temples, they're just shrines, they're smaller. And sometimes they build a new building that serves as the shrine, but another thing they will do sometimes is take old tombs. Think of like the Tholos tombs that the Mycenaeans left behind. Those look significant. Those look like maybe it's a tomb of a hero. And they will use ones that they find in their region, and they will say, oh, maybe this is where the hero's buried, and they'll worship them there. And so it also gives them not just a sense of we're Greek versus everyone else, but we have a sense of our own community identity and belonging to a community, right? We're the group that is protected by this hero and belongs to this particular region. Okay, so those are some of the major things that are happening that are really going to set us up for the next phase of Greek history, this archaic period, which starts somewhere here in the 8th century BC. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.